responsive versus reactive. To me, that's what mindfulness is about, is learning how to get responsive, how to respond, not react to these situations that, press our buttons in these different ways.
Hi, friends, and welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hello, podcast listeners. It is so great to be back with you for another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. I've got a fun one on deck for you today. If you are a parent who has ever felt yourself get dysregulated when your child gets dysregulated, or your child is dysregulated and you don't know how to help them, you don't know how to teach them sort of to work on that regulation piece, today's conversation is for you. I reached out to today's guest a while back because I have and love two of his books and thought, I wonder if he might be willing to come on the podcast, and was so thrilled when he said yes. So in just a moment here, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Willard. Chris is a clinical psychologist, an author, and a consultant based in Massachusetts. He has spoken in 40 countries, has presented at 2 different TEDx events, and is the author of 20 books, including Alpha Breaths, which you're going to hear us talk about in this conversation, Growing Up Mindful, which you will also hear us talk about, and his new book, which is coming out in April 2025, Feelings Are Like Fart. His thoughts on mental health have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, mindful.org, CNN.com, and elsewhere. And he currently teaches at Harvard Medical School. This is a real treat. And I think, wherever you are on your mindfulness practice, or if you're nowhere on a mindfulness practice, this conversation is for you. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Willard here. And so without further ado, Dr. Chris Willard. All right, Chris, it is so great to have you on the podcast. As you and I were talking before we hit record, I have several of your books. I love your books. And I'm so grateful that you said yes to sharing your wisdom today.
Oh, I'm grateful that you invited me and that you've enjoyed my book. So yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Excellent. I want to start with a really kind of foundational question, which is, I'd love to know a little bit about your personal journey to mindfulness. How did this become one of the things that you focus on?
Yeah, I mean, so the origin story that I tell a lot is, when I was growing up in the 80s, like there was no, mindfulness is not a trendy word like it's been for, the last bit of time. And so I never heard it growing up. But I think like many of us, I had these experiences of, being at like a nature camp, and they're like, let's, walk as silently as we can in the woods, like ninjas, or let's listen like a deer, what are all the sounds we can hear around us. And these were actually, I mean, maybe the counselors are trying to get us to shut up. I wouldn't put it past them, a bunch of kids, right? But these actually were these really sweet, connected experiences that then fast forward to, I'm in college, I'm having a hard time, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm doing way too many drugs, and taking time off from college and kind of trying to figure out my life, and stumbling into mindfulness kind of again by the name mindfulness, and thinking back to those experiences of like walking silently in the woods. And if you've ever tried to walk silently, it's kind of the same instructions as walk mindfully, like feel your feet on the ground, try not to think about the past or the future, notice the texture of the ground, right? Notice the sounds around you, try not to react, just really tune in. Like that, those were mindfulness practices that then I was learning, on these retreats and in these courses. And I was finding so transformative in like my early 20s. And that kind of got me started or restarted on the path. And I went back to school. I'm a psychologist now, but I was an English major, and then I was a special education teacher for a while. And all sort of after finishing my undergrad and doing those things, mindfulness was just a through line. And then as I became a psychologist, I did some writing, and that led to like, please do some speaking. And that sounded terrifying to me, but started to have fun doing speaking and workshops. And and all of that, and kind of got things rolling, and then getting chances to write kids books and other stuff like that, which has been a blast. And then 10 years ago, becoming a parent and being, there's a little bit of that, like, what's that sort of joke? It's like, I was the perfect parent in the world until I became one, right? I was the most mindful parent in the world until I, became a parent. I was like, oh, this is a lot harder than I thought. And so, but these great lessons coming out of being a parent, and trying to, get my 10-year-old to buy in, or my 7-year-old to buy in, and, get them interested in these and how that works. And so these days it's like trying to practice personally as a parent to kind of keep myself self-regulated so that I can co-regulate with my kids, who are, I think, no more or less dysregulated than anyone else's kids, but trying to help them get those skills and be that sort of emotional contagion for them. And I do workshops in schools and travel around and do podcasts with wonderful people like you and get to meet you. That's sort of who I am. So yeah, thank you.
I love it. I love it. As a child of the 70s and 80s, I also had never heard of mindfulness. But, it's funny, as you were talking, I can relate to those experiences of being at a summer camp or whatever and being asked to kind of be more present. As you said, maybe it was the counselors just wanted us to shut up. But, but yeah, as you described that, I'm like, oh, maybe that was sort of my first experience with
Yeah.
this. But it is not a skill or a practice that was in any way, shape, or form taught in my home. And I would go so far as to say my father could have benefited from this. Mindfulness was not sort of where he
Uh-huh.
landed. Probably others listening to this can relate to that. There was more reactivity perhaps than responsiveness going on.
Mm-hmm.
And as a parent who did grow up with a more sort of reactive parent, it's obviously been more of a journey. There's been a journey there for me in sort of managing myself. When you're introducing the idea of mindfulness to adults first, how do you explain it to them, and how can we as adults get more mindful, especially in the day and age of cell phones, which, are like the opposite of mindfulness.
Right.
But how can we get more mindful when it's not something that we learned? It's not something that we grew up with.
Absolutely. And that actually, the reason I like to often start when I do a workshop or meet someone and they kind of ask, what is this? I like to start actually with that story that I shared of like walking quietly in the woods, or, like looking at clouds in the sky with my dad or something like that. Because it is this thing we actually all have experienced. We all have done or practiced, whether we sort of knew it or not. It's like innate to all of us as human beings. And so it doesn't have to be this like go to a mountaintop, go spend 8 weeks doing a class. I mean, like if you have time for an 8-week class, or can afford to go to a mountaintop, practice, like great, go for it. Right. But actually the reality is it is so much closer. It is already here. And it's sort of unlearning all the other stuff almost, like, and you're saying even just, with your dad, like, responsive versus reactive. To me, that's what mindfulness is about, is learning how to get responsive, how to respond, not react to these situations that press our buttons in these different ways. As I said, like take a class if you have time, read a book if you have time. Parents, we don't have a lot of time, but like download something, listen to this podcast and other ones, or just experiment with little moments here and there. That doesn't have to be super time consuming. Like you can't parent from a meditation cushion. Like I wish I could, right? But like
Right.
up off my cushion. But it's things like I've got this dad that I work with. I've been kind of telling this story a lot lately. I worked with him many years ago. He actually just came back. I don't know what that says about me as a therapist. Am I great that he wants to come back, or did I really not do a good job the first time? But regardless, we were working together for years. He had this really challenging kid with a bunch of kind of developmental issues. And we sort of finished up our first round of work a few years ago. And I was like, what was the most helpful thing we did? He was like, we had all these conversations, but the most helpful thing was, you said, when I drive home, like, like drive through traffic and blast music and blah, 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 cut people off, get to my driveway and just like stop in my driveway. And before I get out of the car, just like take 3 breaths. And when I'm breathing, like Thich Nhat Hanh says, like when you're breathing, know that you're breathing for 3 breaths, and then walk into the house. And then I might not, he was saying, Chris, I might not be bringing the calm, but at least I'm not bringing the chaos like into the
Yeah.
house when I do that. Because it is like this stuff is, I mean, all of our emotions are contagious, co-regulation and co-dysregulation, right?
Yes.
The bad mood, we bring that home, right? It does affect everybody around us. The kids know, as soon as we walk in or, the other parent walks in, just as we know when they walk in, how their day at school was. And so when we can just be somewhat calm, somewhat regulated, right, we're bringing something really different in. We're bringing a different kind of contagion into the house that can actually calm things down. And research actually shows this too, the way our nervous systems actually kind of connect below our conscious awareness. And so it's this kind of thing. And breathing isn't mindfulness, by the way, necessarily, it's like sort of tangentially related if we want to get technical, but like just being able to know that we're breathing, that is mindfulness.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or taking that moment to like, when we're eating, like, I don't have a half an hour to eat a raisin, like, but I can like take the first couple bites of my meal with all my senses, tasting it, smelling it, feeling the sensations of eating, right? All of that, looking at the colors on my plate, taking a moment to do that. And then, when I do have time to take a half an hour to eat a raisin, like, great, I'll do that. But I don't have as much of that time as a parent.
Yeah.
Um, so it is like, it's those kinds of things. And with kids, it doesn't have to be like, now it's going to be mindfulness time, like get out the timer. Like, I mean, that can be great if you want to do that, but it can also be, let's really think about where this food came from. Let's like
Hmm.
take, like when I'm working with my son, he's got some math challenges lately. I've got math challenges as a parent trying to teach it to him. But like, but last night, and he's getting upset, and I'm like, let's just take a reset breath. Like, let's reset your brain, let's reset your body. I can see your breath is getting agitated, I'm getting frustrated. Let's both just take a reset breath in, right? Reset our brains and bodies, just like you need to reset your computer. I have to restart the router before I met with you to do this podcast because my stupid
Right.
internet's not working today. Right. But like that kind of thing, or like, let's take a moment. My son also, he's like really into soccer. And it's like, it's like he gets nervous. Let's do a meditation before a game. Let's, take a moment, feel your feet on the sidelines, right? Your feet warm or cool? Is the grass or the turf, is it soft or is it hard? Or your feet dry or damp, warm or cool, right? Get in touch with your body, get in touch with the moment. And then you're on the field. And for at least a little bit of time, you're not, I forgot that goal, I forgot to pass it, or what's the matter with me? You're like, that kind of inner voice, inner critic shuts down a little bit. So
Yeah.
these are some more kind of simple ways to bring this stuff in. That's not like ring the bell, family mindfulness time. That was my fantasy when I first wrote these books and first
Right.
had a kid, right? Family mindfulness time, we're all going to meditate for half an hour. And like, yeah, I meditate with my kids sometimes, but it more often looks like, let's feel our feet on the ground. Let's take a reset breath. Let's, take a walk, and let's just try to notice, like, can you count the number of different birds that you hear? Rather than like, let's do mindful listening. It's like, how many different birds do you think we're going to hear when we go out? How many different
Okay.
shades of green are in the forest today?
Yeah. Here's what I love so much about what you're saying. And I noticed this in your book, Growing Up Mindful, is that the way you're describing it right now feels really accessible to me,
Mm.
right? Like that feels really doable. And it reminded me of, several years ago, more than several. I mean, this was well before COVID. I took a mindfulness-based stress reduction class, MBSR, that's based on the work of John Kabat-Zinn.
Yeah.
And we like right out of the gates, the instructor wanted us meditating 45 minutes every day. Whew, that felt, I was like, excuse me,
Yeah.
what? Like, I don't have
Yeah.
time to, it feels like I don't have time to brush my teeth sometimes, let alone
Right.
sit and
Right.
meditate for 45 minutes. And then I would sit and meditate, and it was almost like I would stress me out more, right?
Yeah.
Because it felt so big. I mean,
Right.
to be fair, I think the work, that MBSR work, is great.
Oh,
There's
yeah,
really
absolutely.
fabulous
But
stuff, but it felt really inaccessible for a
right.
new, for somebody new to the idea. And the way
Yeah.
you describe it, like this feels so much more doable.
I hope so. And I hope we can do both too. I mean, it's like, because like, yeah, I took an MBSR class when I was like 22. I didn't have a job. Like, like sure, I got 45 minutes, but like for a parent, like forget it, and it's like,
Yeah.
I joke, it's like, yeah, I get like, I can choose, do I get 22 minutes of exercise while my kids are watching Daniel Tiger, or do I get 22 minutes of meditation, or do I cook dinner, right? Like, what's my choice? I've got 22 minutes. Like,
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And that's how it felt to me. I was like, if I've got 45 minutes, I should be like sweating it out, like going for a run or doing, whatever it is.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
Now I know there are physical benefits to meditation as well, but it just felt like, whoa, you want me to do what? Yeah. And I had a full-time job and a child and, yeah,
Yeah.
really challenging. So, and that story that you tell about the dad who, learned to sort of come home, stop in the driveway, and take those 3 breaths.
Mm-hmm.
I have, like, I don't like to make grand pronouncements, but I have to think that if every single one of us did that
Mm-hmm.
before something stressful, whether it was walking into our homes or giving a presentation or driving in traffic or whatever the thing might be,
Yeah.
the world would be a really different place,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we'd all function at a higher level
Absolutely.
than we
Absolutely.
do.
I mean, I see it in myself when I give myself 3 breaths. I see it in my son when he gives himself 3 breaths and then goes back into doing the math or whatever. I see it, like in my daughter, like, I mean, like the other sort of thing, it's like, kids are very easily influenced slash gullible, right? But it's like I'm playing like, like Uno or Sorry with my kids or something. And like, try not to be bored out of my skull. But it's like, I'm like, oh, this game's getting really tense. Like, I don't know what to do. I'm so frustrated. I just need to take a breath. Right. And then like I watch like my, 7-year-old daughter and we're playing Sorry. And she's like looking at the board and she like leans back and takes a breath. And I'm like, God.
Yes. Yes.
Like, great. When I'm able to model that, like that's how I try to teach it, is in an embodied way. And I feel like it can be those moments. And to me, it's like I talk about this too. Sometimes it's like, we can define mindfulness like paying attention to the present moment with acceptance and non-judgment and doing that on purpose. And it's like, well, first of all, what adult can do that, let alone like, how do you explain that to a 5, 10, 15-year-old? But like, we think about something like math, right? You're not teaching calculus in kindergarten. You're teaching 1 + 1, and then you get
Right.
to, pre-algebra and you do algebra and you get to pre-calculus. And it's like, some of what I'm thinking about is teaching like pre-mindfulness. Like, what's the prep work? What's the prerequisite of some fun breathing, like in alpha breaths, or some fun, like goofy ways of like walking that makes us more aware of walking, that are the little building blocks that can become, if needed or wanted, a mindfulness practice later on. So it's not
Yeah.
suddenly weird, like, what is it you want me to do? Sit still for 45 minutes? Like, it's like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this. Like, I know what it's like to walk quietly. I know what it's like to, feel my breath, imagining it like it's waves in the ocean and the sounds and sensations of my belly rising and falling. And I love the beach. And like that it can plant these seeds, like Thich Nhat Hanh would say, it can be this kind of pre-mindfulness, because it is really hard to get kids to sit still and meditate for long periods of time. And
Yeah.
some can, some can't. And what I really don't want is to be making mindfulness a chore for us adults, or an obligation that we're falling short on, or that we feel guilty about, or we feel like we're a bad parent, and then we pass it on to the kids that they're a bad meditator or they're not good at, like, it's like, no, I just want you to have some fun, feel successful, feel a positive benefit, and then you'll want to go back to it when
Yeah.
you're ready to grow into a deeper practice. Because most of us at some point in our lives, usually we're not like, everything's going great, I'm going to start doing mindfulness. It's like, something's not working, I'm desperate, I'm going to try something like mindfulness. Like,
Yes.
so when
Yeah.
our kids get to that point, whether they're 15 or 25 or 55, right, that they'll be able to look back and be like, oh yeah, I liked that breathing thing, I liked that
Yeah.
listening, I liked that feeling my feet on the ground, or imagining I was a mountain, or whatever it might be. And they can have that positive connection to it and water those seeds again.
You mentioned, as you were just talking, your book, Alpha Breaths, which I happen to have and love. We'll put a link for this book down in the show notes for everybody. I mean, the drawings are fabulous, like the artwork, and just it's a lovely, lovely book. But here's one of the things that I love about it and that I've done with my 7-year-old. It's a little young for my teenager, but we'll come to the meditations for teenagers. But this one, like, we don't always, like, we don't sit down and read the book all the way through. We'll like flip open to a page. So, I just flipped open to C for cake breath, which is breathe in as you imagine a birthday cake and breathe out as you imagine blowing out the candles.
Yeah.
And that's really doable for a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old or, a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old, but she just is,
Right, but it's like that's the training wheels in a way, and the
yeah.
image of imagining the cake can set aside at some point, just like the training wheels can come off, and it kind of can grow developmentally with a kid as they get older. And I think that's what I hope for with that kind of material. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just think it makes it really, well, I keep using this word, but accessible, right? Like this is easy for me as a parent who didn't grow up being taught mindfulness.
Yeah.
I've sort of figured my own way into it, but like to teach it to somebody else is a whole nother level, right? But this makes it really doable and not just accessible for the parent, but also accessible for the child who, yeah, they can imagine a birthday cake and they can blow out the candles. For those of us like me who are raising a teenager, and look, people who've listened to this podcast for any length of time have heard me talk about her. She's an awesome kid. I actually enjoy spending time with my teen. And she's a typical teen, right? She knows everything, right? She's the smartest. I think we're all the smartest that we ever were when we're teenagers. And sometimes getting her to sort of stop and think about what might be helpful is harder than it is with my 7-year-old. And I know you've got some fabulous meditations that you use that are great with teenagers to kind of help introduce them to the practice. Can you talk about those a little bit? Because I know there are parents listening who are parenting teens.
And one of the things I want to say is that even as a parent who does some of the stuff with my kids, it's like my son's approaching, like, critical spraining his eyeballs with rolling his eyes at me age, and like knowing that there's only a few more years. I mean, I think it's also what's great is that it doesn't have to be you. Like maybe it's I mean, I'm a therapist, that's my day job, so maybe it's a therapist, but maybe it's a great drama teacher who can teach breathing exercises or some of these things. Maybe it's a great music teacher. Maybe it's a soccer coach who does a little bit of mental fitness and mental resilience training. These are all just code words for mindfulness, basically. That like it doesn't have to be us, and maybe even when they're teenagers it shouldn't be us, right? That they need to kind of feel like they're discovering this on their own, or finding another figure in their life that they look up to, so they can then reconnect with us kind of on the other side of adolescence. So I want to emphasize that. But then I do think, when I do work with kids, and as I, will be teaching my kids, hopefully, or trying to teach my kids this as they get older into teenage years, it is things like, one of my favorites is like, pick your favorite song and just listen to like one instrument for 4 or 5 minutes. Like, if focus on the bass line. If it goes to the piano, bring it back to the bass line. Like, try that for 4 or 5 minutes, and it kind of promotes and provokes curiosity and mindfulness and single-minded attention in this way. That's much more interesting than saying focus on your breath for 5 minutes. To say pick your favorite song and you try listening to it in this way. And that's a really wonderful coping skill, exploration, creative way of engaging mindfulness, activating the prefrontal cortex, quieting down the limbic system, all those things that we want it to do. That when a kid is having a hard time, rather than saying meditate for 5 minutes before your homework, or before you self-harm or a worrisome behavior, right, that we say try listening to music in this fun way. Like, that's such a totally different introduction, and more fun and more interesting, I think. So to me, it's like finding things like that, or that some of the mindfulness apps now do have like different like celebrities like leading some of the practices. Like, that can be cool. There are some good books for teenagers, and it should be more up on social media, and kind of who's doing this stuff on social media leading practices. But it's like, you got to meet these teenagers where they are and thinking about what matters to them. Like the mistake we make, or that I make sometimes, is like, sometimes I tell this story about, I was working at a school doing a mindfulness group, and I put up posters around the school, and I was like, I'm going to do a little science experiment. And I put up, 50 posters that said mindfulness group and 50 posters that said stress reduction group. And then my email, and I checked my email, and I had like a bunch of emails for the mindfulness group, and actually had like very few emails for the stress reduction group.
Mm.
And what was interesting to me was that, like, for so many kids, they feel like stress is a badge of honor. And so getting rid of stress is getting rid of a part of their identity. And of course, it was the same group, right? Just one was, I just was like kind of curious, like which advertising is going to work better. And
Yeah.
so, thinking about that, or talking about, I mean, I've been surprised at how open teenagers, and like literally around the world, like in Egypt and Singapore and Hong Kong, like, are, Argentina, about mental health issues. So
Yeah.
like, I was giving a talk, and I gave two talks at a school for this high school. In the first group, I talked about stress, and they were in stress and mindfulness, and they were engaged. And then I shifted it in the second talk to talk about mental health and mindfulness, and they were so much more engaged because they
Yes.
wanted to help themselves. Teenagers also, they seem like they're self-centered, they can be, but they really care a lot about their friends. They want to know how they could help their friends. Like, if
Yeah.
my friend's having a panic attack, what do I do? Maybe they're asking for themselves. It's like, I've got a friend who,
Right. Right.
but
Yep.
there is that, like, how do we tap into what the teenage brain is going through? It's being a good friend. It is helping other people. It's an interest in music. It's an interest in novelty. And maybe it is, it's social, get nervous at a party, right? Try, standing up straight and pressing your feet into the ground, like nervous about public speaking, try this. Like, everyone hates having to do, a class presentation. So maybe this can help you with that, right? So where do we help a practice match what their motivation is, which isn't always, for some kids, it's I want to do better in school, right? But some kids, it's, like this therapy kid I saw for like 10 weeks, and about 10 weeks in, he was like, I was like, what are we doing here? And finally 10 weeks in, he's like, can you like help me talk to girls? And I was like, oh yeah, sure. Like totally. Like, why are you talking about social anxiety? Let's just talk about like how to talk to girls. Like, great. Like, but it's like whatever it is that's on their mind, I feel like, and that is motivating them, or their driver's test, or, I
Yeah.
mean, all this stuff I think can be helpful. There's sports games, certainly, with, so many athletes. I loved the Olympics last summer. Oh my gosh, so many athletes talking
Yes.
about mental health, so many talking about mindfulness. It was so inspiring.
It really was. And I think you're totally right. We're seeing the teens of today, and I love that you call it out that it's really global, that are so
Yeah.
much more willing to talk about their inner landscape, right? What's going on for them from that mental health perspective. And there's so much less shame than, back in the 70s and 80s, like you did not talk about that kind of thing, right? It's really different for today's kids. And I also really appreciate that idea of meeting them where they're at, talking about it from that perspective, or finding the in, and recognizing that we as parents may not always be the best
Yeah.
teachers on this. As you were describing the idea of listening to music and trying to follow one instrument all the way through, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try that later today.
You
That
should.
sounds,
It's so
I
fun.
will.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
going to, but that sounds really hard. Like, that sounds really hard because I think it'd be so easy for other pieces of the music, or you start singing along lyrics or whatever, and to bring it back. It feels hard, but on the same sense, it almost feels easier than, this bring it back to your breath, like pay attention to your breath, right?
Breathing is boring. Like, sorry. My son a few years ago told me, Dad, breathing is boring. I'm never breathing again. I'm like, okay, no, he is still breathing is the good news. But it's like, it's true. Like, we have to get creative about this. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that acknowledgement from a mindfulness practitioner. Breathing is boring. So yeah, bringing it to that line in music or something else is really feels just easier to do, although still challenging without any question.
Right. Right.
So I want to ask you, you had a new book come out in 2024. I don't have this book yet being the operative word here. It's called Feelings Are Like Farts.
Well,
Tell
it's not
us.
out yet. It comes out in April, actually. We can finally release, like we signed the contract in 2020 or 2021.
Oh my goodness.
And it's like changing illustrators and changing this, but yes, we will finally let it all out.
I can't wait. So, okay, so April of this year, which is
Yep.
fabulous timing. So tell us about this book that is coming out.
Oh my gosh, it's fun. This friend of mine who I met, she came to a workshop. We kind of became friends. We wrote a book about kind of life and death called Life of a Crayon together. And then she texted me one day, like it was during the pandemic, and she was like, my daughter just, farted and said, Mom, feelings are like farts. I think we should write a book about that. And so we just started texting. I remember vividly just being on this like walk with my kids and being on my phone texting this friend of mine. We basically like wrote this whole book over text message in
Oh,
like
wow.
40 minutes. It's just like they can be silent, but they're never deadly. If they ever hurt, you should probably talk to someone about them. Like you don't want to have them in yoga class or in the library, but it's important to let them out. Like these kinds of things, they can make you laugh with friends. And so we wrote it and then sent it out to my agent, and we ended up with 6 publishers. We had a bidding war on it, which is like, I've
Wow.
like years writing like academic books and get paid, like nothing, and then it's like I write a book about farts over text message, and we have like a bidding war, and and
Not
then
sure what
4 years
that says
later
about our
we can
world.
finally release. But it's my friend Tara Wasiski and I, who's a wonderful art teacher at a friend's school down in New Jersey. But yeah, that's sort of the backstory, and now we're letting it all out. So
Oh, I love it. I cannot wait. Okay, so April 2025, everybody, you can get feelings are like farts. If you've got, I assume this is for younger kiddos, sort of like alpha breaths.
it is, but it's also like now I'm kind of like maybe I should write like an adult book. It's just like instead of 28 fart jokes, it's like 28 short essays on, you feel better if you let them out. If they can wake you up at night, but you can't keep them under the covers. And these other,
Yeah,
they
I
can be
think you're
fast and
onto
fiery or
something.
loud and long. So like, but I kind of think that'd be funny to try to write a grown-up version. So
I'm predicting another bidding
we may
war.
do that at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's when I'm like, oh my God, my teenager would actually love
Right.
that,
Right.
right?
Yeah, as the parent of a boy, it's like, yeah, a lot of the boy moms and boy dads like, oh, okay, here's the way to talk about it.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. Both of my kids are daughters, but all my friends with boys, they're like, farts are never not funny. It's never not
It's true.
funny.
Yep.
Yeah. And actually, I think my girls would probably say the same thing. Oh, I love it. Okay, so tell me, if for the parents who are listening to this, and we've also got educators and, and people who are both parents and educators who are listening into this, if mindfulness, it's hard to live in the modern world without having heard of it, but if mindfulness is feeling really like, I don't even know where to start with that, is there a book or a practice that you think is like the perfect way to for someone as an adult to start their own mindfulness journey?
Yeah. I really love like Sharon Salzberg's Real Happiness. It's like really simple, totally plain language, really accessible. Dan Harris's like 10% Happier and Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. I I very rarely laugh out loud when I'm reading, and I laughed out loud at Dan's book. Those are 2 great places to start. Yeah, I'd recommend both of those. Really good places to start. Yeah, I know
Perfect.
Sharon's book has like a CD that comes with it too, which is nice. CD. I mean, now I'm like aging myself. I'm sure it now has a QR code that you can
Yeah.
download. So,
MP3
uh,
or yeah, exactly. Well, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't also mention your book, Growing Up Mindful, which isn't, it's not an adult mindfulness book, but it does talk a lot about how we can be more mindful and help our children, step into mindfulness. So we'll put links for all of those books down below. Chris, this has been so great. I think, the more that we can all just sort of introduce and try out small practices, and that can invite us into a larger practice, or, a win is just your kids having a meltdown and you don't also melt down, right?
that's the win,
Yeah.
right? I think a lot of us go in thinking my kid's going to have a meltdown and then they're going to be on their meditation cushion, oming away with incense burning. And actually, the win is when we're not getting our buttons pushed and losing it, and we're staying connected. with our kid while they're having a meltdown, or
Yeah.
our own aging parents, or the person on the freeway, or wherever it
Yeah.
is that we are. That's the win. Yeah.
That is the win. And that's how we shift, the overall sort of dynamic, I guess, of our world, if we all get a little bit more mindful in those moments, as you said. Aside from your books, which, as I've said, we'll put links for, where can people find you?
Yeah, drchristopherwillard.com, drchristopherwillard.com. Instagram, I'm drchriswillard, like Dr. Chris Willard. People can email me. I'm not on TikTok, although we're talking when who knows if TikTok will exist, next week.
Right, right, right.
Maybe I should get on TikTok. I don't know. LinkedIn, wherever. And I always welcome like questions, invitations, doing professional developments or author visits to schools and stuff like that. So just reach out. Yeah.
Fantastic. We will make sure folks have all of those links and can find you in all the different ways that might work for them. Chris, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in the world and for sharing your journey and your wisdom with us today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for the great work you're doing. And this is really fun to be connected with you. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone. I hope you got as much out of that conversation as I did. I loved chatting with Chris. He's got a fun energy, and I so appreciate the way that he is invested in keeping mindfulness and meditation and all of those kinds of practices really accessible. And I also appreciate that the win isn't having your child sit on a meditation cushion and manage their feelings. The win is you managing your feelings when they are dysregulated. I would love to hear from you. How does this sit with you? Have you tried any of these practices? Where are you on your own mindfulness journey? It's something that we talk a lot about in the Heartful Parent Academy and that I talk about with my clients because, it's really easy to get dysregulated when our kids are dysregulated. It's tough to stay in that calm spot. So hopefully something that we shared today will be helpful to you. Maybe tonight when you go home, if you're not at home already, you'll sit in the driveway and take those 3 deep breaths, or next time you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off, you'll take a big deep breath and let it go. All right, on that note, I will sign off for this week and I'll see you in our next episode. Until then, be well, parent happy, and reach out if you need support. Cheers.